How's it going, YouTube? This is Tony, or Mirage, and I'm coming back at you with another video. To be honest, I don't have the script for this video planned out, so it's going to be more off the cuff, um, which is kind of a throwback to maybe some of my older videos. Um, but I do have some notes that I'll be kind of looking back at. But I mainly wanted to explore this idea of fruit in Blade's work. And what really inspired me to kind of go down this journey was looking at the Spider album cover, which I'll throw up on screen right now. You can see it's Blade holding a raspberry in his hand, and the spider's on top of the raspberry. And it's a really interesting image. You can also see he has markings on his forehead that I think are written in Aramaic, if I had to guess. I remember at one point I looked up what it means, but if anyone knows the language that's written on his forehead in that album art, link it down below. That would be interesting to kind of delve into. But going back to this idea of fruit, one of the things that struck me off the bat was that it was a raspberry. And I was like, what does a raspberry mean in a literature type of sense? And so when I just typed that into Google, it says that a raspberry is an image of a fruit representing youth, memory, or sweetness. And what I really thought was interesting is that it says, for symbolism of innocence and nature, in a literal sense, wild raspberries in literature often evoke nostalgia, summer, pastoral innocence, or a lost Eden. So, first just talking about the nostalgia, Blade loves to play with nostalgia in his works. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, he talks about Subaru. There's one song where he just talks about Subaru, and I mean, Subaru obviously exists today, but it was, an older car that existed or whatever. And he talks about riding through the mist with no music. I always thought that Blade and the kind of cloud rap movement kind of came up with the vaporwave movement, and vaporwave is kind of 80s nostalgia. You see a lot of nostalgia in Young Lean's Hurt, he's got the N64 controller, he's got all the old CG graphics from the early 2000s, stuff like that. They talk about 2001, which they actually still do recently, because in the song, what's that song called? I think it's the new one where it's a black and white music video, and Young Lean says, "Now we fly from islands like it's 2001. Helicopters on the roof, we make that shit look fun." That song, Victorious. It finally came to me. Yeah, so that was a little bit of a tangent, but nostalgia relating to the raspberry is kind of the main theme I want to look at here. But let's go a little bit deeper into what raspberry is. It says it invokes summer, so that's a theme that Blade has used before. Think about Blue Summer with Woesome, but it says lost Eden is what a raspberry can refer to, a lost Eden. So I just asked Google, I was like, elaborate on the lost Eden. And it says, in literature, the lost Eden associated with raspberries refers to a symbolic state of childhood innocence and the bittersweet realization of its passing. The motif uses the sensory experience of picking wild berries to contrast the pure, unburdened past with the complex, often disillusioned reality of adulthood. And I thought this was so telling, where he's holding the raspberry in the Spider album cover, but he has a spider on top of it, right? And that's the name of the album. And so Google also says it's a duality of pleasure and pain, and that's essentially what Drain Gang is. Loss and gain are the same. So it's very fitting that he uses the raspberry in that art. But the loss of innocence was interesting to me because that's kind of like a theme that Blade explores in his music. It's interesting because like the themes in his music, like they go back and forth between dark and light, obviously. So I don't think that Blade was just like, yeah, we'll just throw a random fruit in there. I think he picked a raspberry for maybe this same meaning. At least that's my interpretation. But getting back to the Lost Eden, of course, this brings us to the Garden of Eden and brings us to, the most famous fruit of all time, you could argue, which is the fruit in the garden, which I don't know if in the Garden of Eden, right, in Genesis. I don't know if it was actually an apple. It's often depicted as an apple, but it's pretty much like any fruit could kind of fill in, So on an even broader level, if you're just viewing it from that motif, like Blade is kind of introducing this idea that the fruit, in this case it's a raspberry, led to a loss of innocence, right? Adam and Eve in the garden, they were without sin, right? They were chilling with God, they were walking with God, but then they partook of the fruit, and all of a sudden now they're not walking with God anymore, and they lose their childlike innocence. They realize they're naked and they try to cover themselves. It's funny that Blade in this album cover, he has no shirt on, which I never thought I would see, but it is extremely fitting. And I like seeing Buff Blade flexing. On a side note, now this it's funny because when I went down all the track list and I was trying to find any references to fruit, there's no references to fruit. It's kind of like how in Crest, I believe it is that red house is the safe house, that he talks about in Glue, and mentions, in some other songs. But in the Crest lyrics, there's no mention of a safe house. Well, similarly here, there's no mention of fruit. People can double check me, but there's no mention of any type of fruit in Spider. But we do see fruit in some of the other albums, and I'll give a few examples here. Off Trash Island, in Victim, Echo 2K says, I made a promise not to eat forbidden fruit. Some like it sour, I want you to be my grapefruit. Some like it sweet, don't do it, it's not good for you. I really know I shouldn't do it, but I got to. I've got to stop it, I've got to get a grip, So he's talking about this, this compelling nature or force inside us that is drawn to the fruit. And in this case, like if you're looking at it from a, what does the fruit mean? Like a spiritual perspective, you're drawn to sin, and it's not even you're drawn to it, but it's also something that like you encounter just like while you're growing up, right? And Blade, this, I don't believe this is a stretch going this far. If you're with me at this point, I salute you. Blade talks about sin as well. I believe in his song off of The Martyr, he says, is there any love for a boy who has sinned, right? So it's like this realization of the loss and gain that is associated with the fruit. Because obviously we wouldn't be drawn to it if there wasn't something that was rewarding or something that made us feel good, right? But there's the realization that, partaking of the forbidden fruit, as Echo 2K talks about, he says it's not good for you. I really know I shouldn't do it, but I've got to, right? And similarly, if we bring this back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve knew they shouldn't have been listening to the serpent, but they still felt like they, they overreached, right? Um, let me double check my notes here. Right. Okay. So, again, we do have. Oh, there's a bee around me. We do have references to fruit in other albums, but not specifically in Spider. There is something close, which I'll mention near the end. But right now I'm going through all the references in the other albums. So in Reality Surf, he says, trees so ripe we got fruit. But then he starts talking about venom in the vial, enemies closer than you, trick them into buying, snakes slither in the spine, take the fruit. So he's introducing this idea of like, we have this fruit and it's alluring, but then like there's people who are trying to take it from us. It's very interesting because discussing the nature of this fruit, which you could substitute in sin. I think you can substitute in sin for the fruit if you're looking at this from a Christian perspective, right? Or from any type of theistic perspective. And bringing in snakes, that's obviously going to be a Garden of Eden imagery, right? I just hope you're following me with that interpretation, right? But let's move on. What I want to talk about for the final thing about fruit is there is one song on Spider, and it talks about Dante's Beatrice. And so I typed in Dante Beatrice and the connection to fruit, and it says in the Purgatorio Canto 28 they encounter the Garden of Eden, Beatrice does, and which is the site of the original forbidden fruit, while in later Paradiso stages she is the fruit of divine wisdom, guiding Dante to salvation. So before, in other videos, I kind of talked about like Shield Gang and like Safe House like being this place of spiritual protection, and so like the fruit has this duality of being good and bad for you, like there's the evil fruit, the forbidden fruit, and then there's the fruit of divine wisdom. And it says that Beatrice represents divine theology, leading Dante from human reason to faith in Paradiso. So I just think that's an interesting connection to tie in when it comes down to the fruit. And when it comes down to spiders, and how they interact with fruit, it reminds me of Blade's Butterfly, where he says, I was in the spider web, but I fell through, So spiders, I think, when you're looking at that album art, it's the representation of the loss of innocence, the evil inside us that is attracted to the fruit, right? And we're attracted to sin, But Echo 2K says, don't do it, it's not good for you, so we have to keep that in mind, But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry I haven't uploaded in a while. I've just been, I've been working and I've been busy with stuff. I am releasing a new album. I'm finalizing the songs to it and getting the album art done, but that will be coming out, so if you guys want to check that out, that would be dope. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and I'll see y'all in the next motif analysis.